Ladies and gentlemen, have you ever looked at your life and thought, this isn't how it was supposed to be? Maybe you had a vision of success that seems out of reach. Maybe you've tried to be the perfect parent, spouse, friend, or believer, and no matter how hard you try, you feel like you're falling short. Well, let me tell you something. Sometimes the problem isn't you. It's the unrealistic expectations we place on ourselves or allow the world to place on us. We live in a time where everything is filtered. We compare our real lives to someone else's highlight reel. We expect to have everything figured out by a certain age, to have the perfect marriage without struggle, to never feel weak in our faith. But when we chase after something that isn't real, we end up exhausted, discouraged, and empty. Let's talk about the difference between faith and fantasy. Faith says, I believe in God's promises even when I can't see them. Fantasy says, I should have everything I want exactly when I want it. One is trust in God's timing, and the other is an unrealistic demand for instant results. Maybe today you feel stuck because you're measuring your life by an impossible standard. Maybe you think God has forgotten you because things aren't happening as fast as you expected. Let me remind you, God's timing is always perfect, even when it doesn't match your timeline. You are not behind, you are not failing, you are exactly where you need to be for what God is doing in your life. So let go of the unrealistic, let go of the need to have it all figured out. Stop striving for perfection and start trusting the process. Because the moment we release what isn't real, we make room for what God is really trying to do in our lives. Amen. We live in a world that constantly tells us what we should be. From the moment we wake up, we're bombarded with images, messages, and comparisons that whisper, you're not enough. Social media feeds are filled with picture-perfect lives, magazines showcase flawless bodies, and movies create love stories that seem too good to be true, and yet we buy into it. We measure our lives against an illusion, chasing after a version of perfection that doesn't exist. But let me ask you something. Who set these standards? Who decided what perfect looks like? Because if we're honest, perfection is always changing. What was considered beautiful 10 years ago isn't the same today. What was once a picture of success is now outdated. The goalposts keep moving and we keep running, trying to catch up with something we were never meant to reach. We push ourselves harder and harder, thinking that if we could just be a little better, a little smarter, a little more successful, then we'd finally be happy. But the truth is, the illusion of perfection is like a mirage in the desert. You get close and it vanishes. You reach one goal and suddenly there's another one waiting. No matter how much you achieve, no matter how much you fix or change, there will always be a voice saying, not enough. Think about it. How many times have you looked at someone else's life and thought, I wish I had what they have? Maybe it's their job, their relationship, their family, or even their confidence. But what you don't see is the full picture. You don't see the struggles behind the scenes. You don't see the nights they cried themselves to sleep, the fights behind closed doors, the insecurities they battled daily. Because no matter how perfect someone's life looks from the outside, they're just as human as you are. That's why we need to stop chasing unrealistic expectations and start embracing reality. The reality is life is messy, people are imperfect, relationships take work, and growth is a process, not an overnight success. But when we let go of the pressure to be perfect, we make room for something far greater. Peace doesn't come from having everything in place. It comes from knowing that even when things are out of place, you are still enough. It comes from understanding that you don't have to prove yourself to anyone. You don't have to meet every expectation placed on you. You don't have to be flawless to be valuable. Think about a diamond. A diamond isn't perfect. In fact, its value comes from its flaws, the unique marks and lines that make it one of a kind. If a diamond were completely flawless, it would lose what makes it special. And the same goes for you. Your imperfections, your struggles, your journey That's what makes you beautiful. That's what makes you real. So what happens when we let go of the illusion of perfection? Freedom. Freedom to live without the fear of failure. Freedom to make mistakes without feeling like you've ruined everything. Freedom to embrace who you are instead of constantly trying to be someone you're not. Imagine waking up in the morning and not feeling the pressure to impress anyone. Imagine walking into a room and not worrying about what people think of you. Imagine chasing dreams because you love them, not because you're trying to prove yourself. That kind of life isn't just possible, it's what God wants for you. God didn't create you to be a copy of someone else. He didn't design you to live under the weight of unrealistic expectations. He made you with a purpose, and that purpose isn't tied to how perfect you appear, it's tied to who you are. So maybe today is the day you stop striving. Maybe today is the day you take a deep breath and remind yourself, I am enough as I am, because you are. Not because of what you've done, not because of how perfect your life looks, but because you are created with worth that doesn't change. The next time you feel the pressure to be perfect, remind yourself of this. Perfection isn't real, but peace is. And when you choose peace over perfection, you'll finally experience the joy of living free. So many people live their lives caught between two extremes. Either they believe for nothing and settle for whatever life throws at them, or they live in a fantasy world expecting things to happen without ever taking real steps of faith. Both are dangerous places to be. One keeps you stuck in doubt, and the other keeps you trapped in disappointment. That's why we need to understand the difference between faith and fantasy. Because God never calls us to fantasy, but He always calls us to faith. Fantasy is wishful thinking. It's sitting around hoping things will change, but never doing anything to align yourself with God's plan. It's imagining a perfect life without any struggles, a journey without obstacles, a path without resistance. But life doesn't work that way. Even when God gives us promises, even when He plants a dream in our hearts, there will always be a process. Faith, on the other hand, is what keeps us moving forward in that process. It's believing in what God has promised even when we can't see it yet. One of the biggest mistakes we make is expecting faith to be effortless. We think that just because God spoke something into our lives, it should happen instantly. But faith is not about instant results. It's about trusting God through every season, even when things don't look the way we expected. Faith doesn't mean you'll never struggle. It doesn't mean you'll always feel confident. It doesn't mean the road will be smooth. But it does mean that when everything seems impossible, you still believe that God is working behind the scenes. Look at the people in the Bible. Every great move of God required faith, not fantasy. When Noah built the ark, it wasn't because he wished the flood away. He had to pick up a hammer and start building, even when people thought he was crazy. When David faced Goliath, he didn't stand there wishing the giant would disappear. He stepped forward with a slingshot and believed God would take care of the rest. When Peter walked on water, he had to step out of the boat first. None of these people lived in fantasy. They lived by faith, and because of that, they saw God move in ways beyond their imagination. Maybe you're in a season where you've been waiting on God to do something. Maybe you feel like you've been praying and believing, but nothing is changing. Can I tell you something? Just because you don't see it happening doesn't mean God isn't working. Faith is believing before you see the breakthrough. It's trusting that God's timing is perfect, even when yours feels delayed. But let's talk about the other side of this. Sometimes we don't just struggle with doubt. We struggle with unrealistic expectations. We think that just because we prayed, things should happen exactly how we imagined. But faith isn't about controlling the outcome. It's about trusting the one who holds it. God is not a genie. He doesn't exist to grant us every wish. His plans are higher than ours. His ways are greater than ours. And sometimes what we want isn't what's best for us. That's why we have to surrender not just our problems, but also our plans. We have to be willing to say, God, even if this doesn't happen the way I thought it would, I still trust you. It's easy to have faith when things are going well. It's easy to believe when everything is falling into place. But real faith is tested in the waiting. Real faith is built in the seasons when you feel like nothing is happening, when doors aren't opening, when the road is longer than you expected. What if the delay is part of the process? What if the waiting is actually preparing you for something greater? So often we think God is saying no when really He's saying not yet. We get frustrated when things don't happen on our timeline, but we forget that God sees the full picture. He knows what's ahead. He knows what we need, and He knows when we're ready for it. That's why we need faith, not the kind of faith that's only strong when life is easy, but the kind of faith that says, even when I don't see it, I believe. Even when I don't feel it, I trust. Even when it doesn't happen the way I imagined, I know God is still good. So today, let go of fantasy. Stop expecting everything to be perfect and start walking in real faith. Faith isn't about having all the answers. It's about trusting the one who does. And when you choose faith over fantasy, you will find peace in the waiting, strength in the struggle, and purpose in the process. One of the greatest struggles people face is the need for approval. Whether we realize it or not, so many of our choices, our emotions, and even our sense of self-worth are tied to what other people think. We live in a world where validation comes in the form of likes, comments, and applause. And without even noticing, we start shaping our lives around the expectations of others. It starts early. Maybe you grew up trying to please a parent who was never satisfied, constantly feeling like you had to prove yourself. Maybe you've spent years chasing after friendships, relationships, or careers that weren't even meant for you simply because you wanted to be accepted. Or maybe you've been so afraid of disappointing people that you've learned to say yes when you really wanted to say no. The truth is, one of the biggest traps in life is trying to meet unrealistic expectations set by others. It's exhausting no matter how hard you try. There will always be someone who thinks you should be doing more, someone who finds fault with the way you live, someone who believes you should be something you're not. And if you spend your life chasing their approval, you will never experience true peace. There's an important realization we all have to come to. You weren't created to live for everyone else's approval. You were created for a purpose only you can fulfill. The more time you spend trying to be what everyone else wants you to be, the less time you spend becoming the person you were meant to be. The Bible tells us in Galatians 1:10, am I now trying to win the approval of human beings or of God? Or am I trying to please people? If I were still trying to please people, I would not be a servant of Christ. That verse is a powerful reminder that when we live for people's approval, we lose sight of God's purpose for our lives. And the truth is, people's opinions change. One day they praise you, the next day they criticize you. If your confidence is built on their validation, you'll be on an emotional roller coaster for the rest of your life. Think about Jesus. He was perfect, yet he was still rejected. The same people who shouted Hosanna when he entered Jerusalem were the same ones who later shouted, crucify him. If Jesus couldn't please everyone, so how do we break free from this need for approval? First, we have to recognize that our worth doesn't come from people, it comes from God. When you truly understand that your value isn't based on how many people like you, what others say about you, or how well you perform, you stop feeling the need to prove yourself. Second, we have to set boundaries. Some people will always expect more from you than you can give. And if you don't set limits, they will drain you. You are allowed to say no. You don't have to explain yourself every time you make a decision that protects your peace. It's not your job to keep everyone happy. It's your job to be obedient to what God has called you to do. And third, we have to get comfortable with being misunderstood. Not everyone will agree with your choices. Not everyone will support your dreams. Not everyone will understand why you're changing, growing, or stepping into something new. But that's okay. You don't need their permission to become who God created you to be. One of the most freeing moments in life is when you realize that you don't have to live under the weight of other people's expectations. You don't have to perform, pretend, or strive for approval that will never be enough. You can choose to live for an audience of one. When you stop chasing approval, you find confidence. When you stop worrying about what people think, you find peace. And when you let go of unrealistic expectations, you step into the freedom of becoming exactly who you were meant to be. One of the biggest burdens people carry is the pressure to have everything figured out, fixed, and perfected in a short amount of time. We set unrealistic deadlines for our growth, our healing, and our success, thinking that if we don't reach a certain point by a certain time, we have somehow failed. But life is not a race. There is no timer on God's plan for your life, and there is no expiration date on His promises. We live in a world that glorifies speed, fast results, quick fixes, instant gratification. Everything around us tells us that if something isn't happening now, then it's not happening at all. But God doesn't work on human timelines. His process isn't rushed. When He is developing something in you, He takes His time. Just like a seed doesn't turn into a tree overnight, your journey, whether it's healing, success, or spiritual growth, will not happen instantly. One of the biggest mistakes we make is measuring ourselves by someone else's timeline. We look around and think they got married before me, they got the promotion before me, their ministry is growing faster than mine, their life seems so much further along, and before we know it, we start questioning God. Why am I not there yet? What's wrong with me? Did I miss something? But let me remind you, just because your process looks different doesn't mean you're behind. God doesn't compare your journey to someone else's, so why should you? The truth is, some things take time. Deep healing takes time. Real transformation takes time. Strong relationships take time. Lasting success takes time. And most importantly, spiritual growth takes time. Think about the story of Joseph in the Bible. God gave him a dream as a young man, showing him that he would be in a place of great leadership. But what happened next? He was betrayed by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, thrown into prison, and forgotten. For years, his life looked like anything but the fulfillment of God's promise. But through every setback, God was preparing him. And when the time was right, Joseph stepped into the position God had for him, not a moment too soon and not a moment too late. If Joseph had given up in the waiting, he would have never seen the promise come to pass. And the same goes for you. Just because it's taking longer than you expected doesn't mean it's not happening. God is working even in the waiting. Sometimes the delay is for your protection. Sometimes it's for your preparation. And sometimes it's because what God has planned is even bigger than what you imagined. One of the hardest things to do is to have grace for yourself in the process. We are our own worst critics. We think we should be stronger by now, further along by now, completely healed by now. But the reality is, growth doesn't happen in straight lines. Some days you feel strong and other days you feel weak. Some days you're moving forward and other days you feel like you're standing still. But God's grace isn't based on how fast you get there. It's available every step of the way. Maybe today you feel like you're stuck. Maybe you feel like you're falling behind. Maybe you've been frustrated because you thought things would be different by now. But I want to encourage you, don't let unrealistic expectations steal your joy. Don't let the pressure of a rushed world make you doubt God's perfect timing. You are not late. You are not failing. You are exactly where you need to be for what God is doing in your life. So take a deep breath, let go of the timeline you created in your mind, stop comparing your progress to someone else's, and most importantly, trust that the God who started a good work in you is faithful to complete it. Life isn't about how fast you get there, it's about who you become along the way. And when you walk in grace, you walk in peace. When you stop striving and start trusting, you will see that every delay, every detour, and every season of waiting was never wasted. It was always part of the plan.